roughly 65,000 kilometers south of the Sahara's green heyday, in a stretch of West Texas that today looks like the surface of Mars. Archaeologists found something that shouldn't have made sense: 60 wells dug by hand into the bone-dry bed of a lake that no longer existed. Not one or two desperate attempts. 60, some barely a foot deep, one of them over 5 feet down, carved by people using nothing but their hands and simple digging tools, chasing water that kept retreating further from them every single year. This was Mustang Springs, and the wells date to a period between roughly 7,000 and 5,000 years ago, a stretch scientists now call the mid-Holocene climatic optimum. It sounds pleasant. It was not. It was a 2,000-year warm, dry stretch following the end of the Ice Age, and across the region the water table dropped by as much as 10 feet. For the people living there, this wasn't a bad season. It was a bad 2 millennia. The video's real question isn't what ancient people did when it didn't rain for a while. Everyone can picture that. The real question is what an entire population does when the water doesn't come back. Not next season, not next year, but for so long that no one alive remembers what normal used to look like. And the archaeological record has an answer pieced together from 4 continents, and it is stranger and more resourceful than the popular image of primitive people simply wandering off in search of greener land. For most of human history, drought wasn't a crisis that ended in abandonment. It was a problem that got engineered around. Start with those wells at Mustang Springs. Archaeologist David Meltzer of Southern Methodist University, who excavated the site in the early 1990s, found that the well depths increased in a rough sequence: shallow ones first, then progressively deeper ones dug nearby as the shallow wells ran dry. That sequence is essentially a timeline of a community failing, adapting, and failing again, told entirely through holes in the ground. Communities weren't leaving. They were following the water table downward, meter by meter, refusing to give up the site. So what happens when digging deeper stops being enough? Roughly 1,300 kilometers northwest, in Utah's Great Basin, a cave now called Danger Cave preserves the next stage of that answer. As freshwater lakes in the region dried up during the same long drought period, the archaeological layers show people shifting almost entirely onto a plant most modern visitors would walk straight past: pickleweed, a scrubby desert shrub that produces seeds barely larger than a grain of sand. University of Nevada, Las Vegas paleoclimatologist Matthew Locknett, who has studied the region's cave sediments, found that the floor of Danger Cave contains a thick layer of chaff. The husks left behind after thousands and thousands of these tiny seeds were painstakingly stripped and processed by hand. Not a delicacy, a last resort eaten in bulk for generations, because the alternative was starvation. Here's the part that should feel uncomfortable. Locknett's research isn't just describing the past. The same regional climate pattern that dried up the Great Basin thousands of years ago is reasserting itself right now, which is precisely why paleoclimate data like this matters to anyone living in the American Southwest today. Half a world away, and roughly 4,000 years later, an entirely different civilization ran the exact same experiment and got a completely different result. Around 4,200 years ago, the ancient city of Caral in Peru's Supe Valley, the oldest known urban civilization in the Americas, was hit by a prolonged drought severe enough to cripple its agriculture. Peruvian archaeologist Ruth Shady, whose team has excavated the related sites of Vichama and Peñuco, found that Corral's monumental city was eventually abandoned. But, and this is the detail that changes the whole picture, the surrounding communities didn't collapse into violence over the disappearing water. The archaeological record shows no mass graves, no burned fortifications, no signature of the resource war a modern audience might expect. Instead, populations relocated, restructured, and rebuilt at new sites, apparently without descending into the kind of conflict later civilizations turned to when the water ran out. For decades, the textbook explanation for stories like these has been simple. The rain stopped, and the people followed the rain elsewhere. Sites go quiet in the archaeological record, and drought gets blamed. Case closed. Except a newer body of research is dismantling that explanation, one excavation at a time. On the Carmel coast of northern Israel, an international team drilled mud cores from ancient wetland sediment, layered over thousands of years, reconstructing a detailed climate record for the region. Around 6,200 BCE, a sudden global cooling and drying event, called the 2-kiloyear event, hit the coastal Levant hard, and archaeologists long assumed it emptied the coastline. But underwater excavations at a submerged village called Habonim North, led by Asaf Yasser Landau of the University of Haifa, alongside researchers from UC San Diego and Bar Ilan University, uncovered stone tools, fishing net weights, and pottery that tell a different story. The village wasn't abandoned during the drought. It was thriving through it. Thomas Levy, a co-author on the study and professor at UC San Diego, put it plainly: the finding is really about human resilience, not human retreat. That same research group later found something even more specific. The people of the ancient Levant didn't just wait out drought conditions passively. Studies of the Negev highlands trace a technique called floodwater farming back to the Bronze Age. Low stone walls and terraces built specifically to trap and redirect the rare violent runoff from rainstorms, turning a handful of unpredictable wet days a year into just enough water to keep crops alive through the dry months surrounding them. Herding practices shifted too, spreading risk across more resilient animals and more flexible grazing patterns. So the full picture isn't collapse. It's not resilience either. Not exactly, it's improvisation, repeated across every dry landscape on Earth, refined generation after generation, until it looked less like desperation and more like infrastructure. Digging deeper, eating smaller, rebuilding elsewhere without going to war over what was left, trapping the little rain that did fall before the ground could swallow it. None of these were dramatic gestures. None of them looked like survival in the cinematic sense. They looked like 60 holes in a dead lake bed, a floor covered in seed husks, a handful of stone walls angled just right to catch runoff nobody else thought to catch. Slow, unglamorous, and, across 4 continents and 7,000 years, remarkably effective. Every tap turned on today, every reservoir behind every dam, sits on top of that same unbroken habit. Humans, faced with water disappearing quietly and stubbornly refusing to stop looking for it.